tonight who will be joining in. And for that cast of characters, obviously, when your time comes up, you need to unmute your video and your audio and to present your case. Well, now here we begin with a beautiful picture, an aerial view of the Corinthian area. I've been there a few times, and it's really quite an amazing ancient place to study and look at. And we want to begin by looking at the background tonight, the city of Corinth. Now here is one of the major temples, the Temple of Venus, and the Corinthians really worshiped the goddess of love, as you can all imagine. But this is where it all began. Right from the ancient times of ancient Greece, Corinth and the plains of Corinth around it was a central battlefield between Athens and Sparta, as you know of their famous battles and the wooden horse and all that kind of stuff. Much of their battling was done in the very fertile, lush plains there in Corinth. Corinth not only was a theater of war, but of course, it was a great commercial center. It was a crossroads between Rome in the west and Persia in the east, Egypt in the south, and Eurasia in the north. And so commercial goods came through the Corinthian straits there all the time. It also was special because it provided a popular shortcut between the Adriatic and the Aegean seas. Now, back in the day, the sailors with all of their cargo like to hug the shore, not go out into the deeps. And between the Aegean and the Adriatic was this little 2-mile patch of ground. And so what they would do is they'd come in there with their boats from one side or the other, and you see the stone sort of sidewalk here. They actually rolled carts with the cargo, or if they were smaller ships, they actually put the ships up on wheels and crossed over this isthmus of Corinth, which was famous because it was such a shortcut. Now, Julius Caesar was the one who actually rebuilt Corinth in about 47 BC. Corinth had been totally destroyed when 100 years before that, the Romans had captured Greece and destroyed Greece. And Corinth was one of the major seaports, so they completely leveled and destroyed it. But Julius Caesar rebuilt it. And in rebuilding it, he made it a wonderful Roman city. And while he was there, he said, you know what, let's cut a canal through that 2-mile stretch. And soon after that, he died a violent death. And later on, Nero tried it. And later on, Caligula tried it. And after trying and not succeeding, they could not cut that channel. They all died violent deaths. So this road was known as the Corinthian curse on the Roman Empire. And but Corinth, at the time of Paul, was one of the 5 most important cities in the Roman Empire, along with Rome, and along with Alexandria, and along with Ephesus. This was one of the major cities in the Roman Empire at that time. Now, when Julius Caesar rebuilt the city, he rebuilt it a Roman city. As you can see in this picture, there's the amphitheater, there's a stadium, there's a huge tract of government buildings there. And when he rebuilt the city, half the population he imported from Rome, like veterans and rich merchants. And so even though it was in Greece, it was very proud of its Roman heritage. So it was a Roman city. It had all of those things that you'd want, you know. When Rome rebuilt Corinth, they imported Roman citizens, slaves, soldiers. They built all of those circuses and all this kind of stuff. And so Corinth became the Roman capital in Greece. It was very important to realize that this was the absolute center. So that's why when Paul got in a great riot, the Gallio, the proconsul, he was the
Mhm.
governor of Greece in those days, and he's the one who sat up on the time at the time, and so on and so forth. So they had all of their plays and their philosophy schools and everything. But as far as Greek culture, it was second only to Athens, of course, you can imagine. There were three populations in the modern city: the Romans, the Greeks, and what they called the Asians. And those were the Jews, those were people from Turkey, what we call Turkey today, Syria back in those days, even from Babylon. So everything on the eastern side was very Eastern, and on the western side, it was very Roman. And of course, the key to the city was it was a great shipping port. And the wonderful thing about the shipping port was because you had to drag your cargo across the thing, people spent the night there. And when people spend the night there, bad things can happen. And of course, that's why Corinth became such a kind of a sinful city. You can imagine all the sort of nightlife down there by the shore, and actually, it had two sides to it. Over on the Western Roman side, the Adriatic Sea, they spent the night in Cenchrea, which is a place we know that Paul visited, and it mentions it in the Bible. And on the eastern side, there was another port there called Lachian. And these separated sort of the two sides of the commercial sides of Corinth. So um, there was, of course, a temple of Venus and all this kind of stuff. But the main temple there had to be the temple to Octavia, because, of course, they worshiped the emperor back in those days. And so they would always go up and light some candles there. But of course, the fun place was the Temple of Venus, where they had wonderful feasts, and of course the goddess of love sponsored it all. So when these commercial shipper guys came in there, they would go up to the temple and they have these wonderful feasts and prostitutes and wonderful worship and all. And so Corinth was really a busy, busy Roman city. This is kind of an artistic view, but you can see what kind of a town it was. When we have the terms uptown and downtown, it actually comes from these ancient days, because when you had a city, uptown was up in the cooler sort of mountains, as we have a picture up here. And then down by the sea, you see where it's kind of hot and sweaty and all of this kind of stuff. So it was quite a place in those days. And I think this picture is kind of interesting because it shows the kind of Roman aspect of the whole thing. Now, when it comes to the church in Corinth, the church had to be born there. And of course, there's a lot behind the story of how it would be born. And so what I'd like to do is ask at this time Priscilla and Aquila about this. So Aquila, are you there?
Shalom.
Ah, there you are.
I'm Aquila, the tent maker.
Shalom and chesed to you. I am Priscilla, originally from Pontus in Syria.
We were part of the diaspora of Jews who spread out over the empire. Our business was tent making. We lived in Rome until the summer of 49, when Emperor Claudius expelled us Jews from Rome because of rioting and stirring up trouble over Jesus the Messiah. The Roman historian Suetonius said that it was instigated by someone called Prestus, which is what a Roman would call Christos, Greek for Messiah. Anyways, we moved to Corinth, where tents were even more in demand.
Quills, honey, you're not telling the whole story. You see, while we were working in Rome, some of our Jewish friends in the synagogue started talking about Yeshua, the Messiah they had believed in during Pentecost in Jerusalem. We believed the gospel of Yeshua, and so when we were kicked out of Rome, we prayed and the Lord led us to Corinth. Why did the Lord want us to go here? We wondered. Eventually, we had our answer when Paul came into the synagogue wearing his distinctive robe as a Pharisee.
Thank you very much for that, Priscilla and Aquila. We'll get back to you a little bit later. But why don't we ask Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, to tell what happened next?
I was the chief ruler of the synagogue when Paul the Pharisee came to us in spring of 51. Seeing his robes, I asked him to read from the scrolls on the Sabbath. What happened next was a spiritual earthquake. After reading Abraham's promise to his seed in Genesis, he rolled up the scroll and began speaking about Abraham's promised seed being one man through whom all the nations would be saved. He said, Yeshua the Nazarene was that promised seed who fell into the ground and died for all men and was raised again as his living Mashiach and Adonai. He spoke of his meeting him on the road to Damascus and how he saw the Shekinah glory which felled him to the ground.
All right, Aquila, what do you got to say about that?
That's where Prissy and I met Paul. He spoke about a new community, the called out ones, and how Yeshua's death not only saved both Jews, but also God-fearing Gentiles, but had made us one new people by his Holy Spirit. He came back and preached for the next few Sabbaths, and amazingly, even Crispus, one of the synagogue leaders, was saved and baptized at the seacoast.
But wait, Quiz, you're forgetting to tell what happened after the first Sabbath. We welcomed him to our home for a meal and found out he was our tent maker, too, you see? I knew God led us to Corinth. When we first saw Paul, he had a black eye and bad bruises he received from beatings and imprisonment in Philippi. And a month before, he told us he had made his way through Greece and was waiting for his co-workers to come to him here. But since he was alone, he stayed at our home and worked on our tents with us in the morning and argued with Jewish merchants in the Agora every afternoon.
All right, Sosthenes, so you better catch us up now. So Paul's in the synagogue. He's arguing every day, and there's Aquila and Priscilla in there. So what happened?
Well, Paul kept preaching every Sabbath in the synagogue until a great controversy arose when Gaius, a God-fearing Gentile who attended our synagogue, believed in Yeshua and was baptized by Paul. The Jews couldn't accept Gentiles into their faith, and the whole Jewish quarter erupted in riots. The commotion ended up at the marketplace Bema, where Gallio, the governor of Greece, sat to judge the controversy. Though I, as synagogue leader, made a good case against Paul, the governor dismissed his case, and the angry Jewish mob turned on me and beat me up in their fury.
That must have been a rough time for you as a synagogue leader.
Yes, but as you can see, I soon became a believer myself and was with Paul as a co-worker when he wrote 1 Corinthians. Gaius, since your baptism caused the riot, why don't you take up the story of what happened next?
After the riot, Paul shook the dust off his feet, left the synagogue, and right next door to the house of Titius Justus, a wealthy Gentile businessman who had also believed in Yeshua. Every day, Paul preached to Romans, Greeks, Jews, Syrians, there in Justus's courtyard, right by the marketplace.
Oh, but don't forget, guys, those who were saved would meet in our house every night where we ate and sang and prayed and asked Paul a million questions.
Okay, well, from the first letter to Corinth, but there must have been a tremendous gospel harvest. Let's ask Titius Justus, TJ, in whose courtyard much of that preaching was done next door to the synagogue, to tell us all about the church growth.
After the riots, the Lord came to Paul in a night vision and told him to not be afraid. He said he would protect him because he had so many chosen ones yet to be saved in Corinth. It was about that time that Timothy and Silas arrived and joined Paul in gospel work at my house.
And we lost the best tent maker we ever had. Never saw a guy who could talk so much and still cut up and sew goat skin so quickly.
Yes, but Quiz, it's right after Timmy and Silas came to that the Spirit came down. Remember, we were meeting at our house when the Spirit came down, like on the day of Pentecost back in Jerusalem. People prophesying, speaking in tongues, worshiping like we never experienced in the synagogue. And Silas got up and told everyone what had happened back at Pentecost because our Gentile believers hadn't heard.
Okay, TJ, what happened next?
Sorry, we were on mute.
Mute. I don't know which meetings were more powerful, when the three of them preached, taught, and performed miracles at my house in the daytime or night as the believers gathered. There was such life, testimonies, visions, prophecies, tongues, hospitality, and a sense of deep unity and love whenever we broke bread together. Within about a year, the church exploded to a few hundred from all walks of life. Jews, Gentiles, merchants, slaves, scholars, and several prominent Corinthian women who underwrote Paul's work. It was amazing to see businessmen speaking in tongues and slaves prophesying and teaching the way of Yeshua. Crispus bought as many Jewish scrolls as he could find, and apostles would then translate them and show where they spoke about Yeshua the Messiah.
Well, we also know that the good beginnings can later become problems, which need to be handled by men of authority like Paul. We know after a few years, enough problems had arisen to call Paul to write one of his longest letters. There was a woman named Chloe, who was a prominent lawyer and lived in a villa on the seacoast of Kenkrea. She had real discernment of the problems and their causes and wrote to Paul about them. Chloe, tell us what was going on.
The church grew in size and spiritually after Paul and his coworkers left. By then, we had 3 meetings, one at Quill's and Prissy's, one at TJ's, and a third at my place. Gradually, some difference arose which we hadn't foreseen, but which makes sense naturally. Our Jewish brethren tended to gather up at Quill's house, while converted Greek scholars from the famous schools of philosophy and rhetoric tended to meet at TJ's. Down here on the coast, we opened our house to the many slaves, maritime workers, and household women from the area. The problem was, we didn't realize how blessed we were. Eventually, our church drew Peter, Apollos, and others here, and the groups started taking sides. The Jews at Priscilla's house loved Peter's teaching, and actually, whenever he visited, many people got saved. But when Apollos came along at TJ's, and those more educated were drawn to his rhetoric and powerful speaking. Of course, we down here in Kenkrea loved Paul's care and labor among even the simplest. I guess our natural differences started to hurt our love and unity. There were other problems too, but that's what I was most concerned about.
Well, thank you, Chloe. And what happened after you and Priscilla left with Paul and moved to Ephesus, Aquila?
When we left, we kept in contact with the saints at Corinth, who used to meet at our home. We began to hear they were having a lot of problems with moral and legal issues among them. Some of the believers were still pretty worldly in their lifestyle.
It's important to see the great differences the Jewish believers had with the Gentiles. The Jews were highly moral, even legalistic, I'm afraid. But the Gentiles came from a very sin-drenched world and didn't have the same aversion to unrighteousness. As a result, some saints were meeting and worshiping with us, but still involved in sexual immorality.
Let's get a final perspective from Crispus, who gave valuable oversight as one of the elders in Corinth.
Now, I want to be clear about one thing. With all the problems we have in the church, I would not trade it for my whole previous life as a synagogue leader. Despite any chaos, there is real wonderful spiritual life. I remember seeing how Apollos was blown away when Aquila and Priscilla sent him here to Corinth, and he saw body life and agape love everywhere. As Paul preached and emphasized while here, the cross really is necessary for us to remain a good testimony of Yeshua the Messiah.
Well, praise God. I'm glad you have that testimony. And we know that Paul surely loved the Corinthians and had poured his life into them. But what about the disorder and the spiritual problems there, Crispus?
First, the problem developed among those who were saved from spiritual darkness and idolatry. They were saved and received spiritual gifts, which they eagerly displayed whenever they gathered. Isn't that great? Now, the problem was when everybody was speaking at once, and the elders had a hard time bringing to order at the meetings. Then there was the problem of the Lord's Day, when we'd have love feasts and breaking bread. We'd gather in TJ's courtyard, and it's a nice courtyard, but sometimes the more prosperous merchants were having lavish meals, while the servants had much less. It just kind of hurts unity.
And Gaius, what about that list you sent to the Apostle Paul?
The Gentiles especially lacked Bible knowledge, and some of their teachers began teaching on surrogate baptizing for the dead, that there's no resurrection for us, and that grace has removed all our sins, and whatever adultery or sexual immorality practice was covered over and forgiven. Holy living is so new to them that they even wonder if marriage should be abandoned together.
Well, thank you for those insights into Corinth. Paul's letters hit directly home on all these matters and urged the Corinthians to deny themselves and bear the cross. Next week, we'll begin where Paul began, commending the church and then pressing them with his message of the cross. So that's all for tonight. Just a little message with stars from ancient Corinth. It's amazing the time machine that we could use tonight. And how about if all of them just come back on one more time, since this is the Corinthian Zoom network, CZM TV, and just say a final word, and then we'll be over and out. Aquila and Priscilla.
It was nice meeting all of you. Very good.
Stop.
Hope you visit soon.
I watched a Big Fat Greek Wedding to learn my accent.
Yes, well, you did a wonderful job. Oh, who's that?
If all the actors can speak at the same time, you guys will be on the speaker mode.
Okay.
Hey, Chloe, Gaius, invite me to your guys' place. Looks really great.
That's very forward.
It's a great
See you
view.
at TJ's next barbecue, guys.
I think you take the cake, Gaius.
I agree.
Well-
I think Gaius won the award.
Yeah, that's a lot of imagination there. I'm sure he dressed just like the original Corinthians. Well, as you can see, that's our story. Corinth was a living church, a powerful church, a spiritual church. But boy, they sure had problems. And what we need to be is a powerful, a living, a spiritual church, but have the Lord deal with us in such a way that we can also be a holy church. All right, so anybody else want to make a comment? You're welcome to chime in here, and then we're gonna just call it a night.
Yeah, I got
Anybody
one.
else?
Yeah, one quick question. Grace, what do you think?
Dana, I have a question. This is Ray. I think I may have missed it. Who is TJ?
What's his Reyes Valerius?
Yeah.
Weren't you there in Corinth too?
Who's TJ? I had a roommate named TJ. I don't think he was there.
My name is Titius Justius.
And where do we get that from? Because I missed that in Acts 18. Where is that?
So Paul stayed in my house.
So, it's been so long that he's forgotten how to say his name, which is Titius Justus. But anyway, what happened was when Paul got kicked out of the synagogue, TJ had a house right next door. And he opened up his house, and he was a rich merchant. And so he probably had a courtyard there. And so Paul just kept preaching right next door to the synagogue. And of course, the Jews had a real problem with that. But it was while he was working in TJ's courtyard that so many people got saved. And then they would meet over in Priscilla and Aquila's house, and later on in TJ's house, and later on in Chloe's house, you know, because that was the church. They met in houses, and then they'd gather together in the courtroom of, in the courtyard of TJ, and Paul or Timothy or Silas would preach away. Anybody else have any comments? You'll have to come in here with audio and video.
Saint Xenia of the Grecian Isle would like to say she really appreciated that reenactment, and she'd like to join next year.